Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to Reading Aristotle's Politics. Today we'll be looking at Chapter 10 of Book 2 of the Politics, which deals with the Cretan regime. Last time we met, we did with the Sparta. This is like finally in Chapter 9, 10, and 11, we'll get real regimes, actual regimes. The first was Sparta, which was mostly critical. Now we're going to talk about Crete. Okay, so let's go right to the text, right to the body. Chapter 10, starting. The Cretan regime is very close to this one. That is talking about Plato, the Platonic regime, right? Not Platonic, the Spartan regime, the Spartan. While it has a few features that are not worse, most of it is less fully finished. In other words, it's kind of, he says, it's not, regime is not fully complete in its normal sense. Now let's see what 98 points to here. He says expression refers to a type of regime that is evidently common to most of all the independent Cretan cities. Crete was not politically unified in that time. Therefore, the Cretan regime talks about, in this sense, there's not one unified Crete. Rather, it is something typical. This regime that they have here is something typical for all the cities of Crete, all the polises, all the political bodies of Crete. Okay, so therefore, this is a common regime. This is like a nation in that sense. It wasn't unified, but it has this typical things. Now, it's similar to this in that sense, the Spartan one, right? But it's not fully finished in that sense. It appears, as it is said, that the regime of the Spartans is an imitation of the Cretan in most respects. So the idea is that the Cretan regime came first. The archetype of the Cretan thing came first. It's more archaic, older, and the Spartan is kind of an imitation of it, or of it, right? But the most ancient things are less fully articulated than newer things. That's another point. That older things are less developed. Newer things are more developed. More adds more. So as newer institutions emerge, or newer bodies come into being, often when it does it, it learns from the past and expands on them, and because it's big, things have to be bigger. The older communities tend to have less needs, smaller sizes, and therefore the structures were less developed. They didn't know they didn't have experience of what was needed. Now they do. In other words, at the time they have learned some things. They know more about what is needed, and what would work, what has worked, and what hasn't worked. So therefore, that's why the regimes tend to have more developed in the sense as we move forward in the kind of aspect of development, of political development. Now, next two, they say that Lycurgus, when he gave up his stewardship of, when he gave up his stewardship of King Callias and left home, spent most of his time in Crete on account of kinship. In other words, and for the Lycterians were colonists of the Spartans, and those who had gone to the colony had adopted the arrangement of the laws that existed among those who dwelt there. So he went to Lycretan. These were colonists from Sparta, and on Crete, and they adopted the laws that these people, these Lacedaemonians, who came from Lacedaemon, Sparta, in the Peloponnese, went down to the island on Crete and founded a colony. And although they were Lacedaemonians and Peloponnesians, Doric in that sense, they adopted the character and the regime of the Cretans. And like Lycurgus, the founder, the man who created the regime for Sparta, he was a steward of the king. As he left that stewardship, he went to stay with his family relatives who were there, and that's where he learned these things, right? Even now, the subjects use them in the same manner. and assumed that Minos was the first to initiate this arrangement of the law. So therefore, um, here he says, for the deviations of Spartan regime from the Grecians, see Herodotus 1.6 and Epidaurus, and this is a fragment, on the account which Aristotle here seems to draw on in other respects as well. So therefore, these two accounts. Aristotle's argument is that the Spartan colonists in Crete adapted the institution of the original inhabitants, the people who were subsequently still became their subjects or serfs. In other words, ironically, in other words, the captures they became the local. The Spartans came and then conquered them, but then they adapted the habits of those who conquered. Now, this is something will be similar with the Normans in conquering the English, the Anglo-Saxon England. They, to some degree, they do wipe out aspects of it, but they embrace other aspects. So that this, and the same thing what happens to the Mongols when they go to when they conquer China. Same thing happens, right? They adopt the habits of the people they conquer. Um, um, in other words, original inhabitants, people who subsequently become their subjects or serfs, that the subjects still retain most of their ancestral institutions was indicated at an earlier point. This is chapter 5, book 2, chapter 15, chapter 5. Okay. Now, let's go back here. Um, the island seems naturally situated for rule in Greece. It lies across the entire sea, and most of the Greeks are settled around the sea. It is not distant, far distant from the Peloponnese on the one side, and on the other from the parts of Asia around Cape Tropum and Rhodes. Hence, Minos established rule over the sea, subduing some of the islands and settling others. And finally, he attacked Sicily and ended his life there in Cranium. Now, this paragraph is detached from the main argument and probably represents an annotation of Ray Lewis' argument. Newman suggests it may be entirely an extract from the historian Euphorus. Crete had been a seat of the maritime empire established by the semi-mythical Minos, right? Check Thucydides, book 1, chapter 15. That's actually, if you see my discussion of this in the first part, Thucydides gives this long history of the early Greece, right? In the first book of the Peloponnesian War, but played little role in the politics of the Greek world during the classic period. Okay, Minos really didn't have much. He's a mythical creature. He established an empire. He didn't really. He's not around for a lot of the emergence of the polis as a political structure in that sense. You know, even he predates even the Trojan War in that sense. So therefore, this is what's interesting. Let's go back. Um, and he ends his life and he attacks Sicily. The argument goes this is some people argue this is amendment. Newman argues this that Newman is the classic scholar in turn of the century, gave the 3-volume critical edition in English. It's worth but that's just so this question is, how does this paragraph really, this is background information about Minos, that it doesn't really, it gives the geography, but then this here talks about Minos to some degree, the legendary founder. Remember, Crete has the legendary founder of Minos, a semi-mythical god, a being slash god, right? Founded by a god. Where Lycurgus, Sparta is founded by a man, Lycurgus, a great man, one of the greatest men in classical times. So just remember that a god, this is founded by a god, but the other one's the founders, as founders, right? Specifically stated known founders. The Cretan arrangement corresponds to the Spartan. He repeats this again. For the Helots, a farm for the latter, while the subjects do it for the Cretans, the people people who they've been conquered by, the Dorians and the Ionians who conquered them and imposed upon them, so that the people the native Cretans were there. Now, and both have common messes, which the Spartans call the men's mess rather than the friends' mess in ancient times. just as the Cretians do now, from which it is clear that they came from there. So, in other words, the friends' messes. The same holds for the arrangement of the regime. So that there's similarities of this, right? For the overseers have the same power as the so-called orderers in Crete, except for the ephoi in the Greeks in Sparta, and then the orderers, those who give order. I think it's not fun to work with, except that the former are 5 in number and the latter are 10. So therefore, um, um, in other words, there's 5 ephoi and 10, I think. The senators are the equal of their senators. The senators are equal of their senators, whom the Cretians call the council. So they're not senators, there's the council, right? As for the kingship, there is only one in early times, but the Cretians later overthrew it, and the orderers now have the leadership in war. So therefore, the king they got. There used to be a king, but the king was overthrown, and the orderers took over the role of the king. Okay, so it's you don't have the king institution of the king anymore in the Cretians, where the institution of the king is in Sparta. We talked about was divided, right? It was always there, it's permanent. So therefore, this is interesting in that sense. And all take part in the assembly, but it has authority to do nothing other than ratify proposals of the senators and the orderers. So therefore, every citizen, all the citizens partake in the assembly, but the assembly only ratifies proposals of the senate. They have no authority, but it has authority to do nothing other than ratifying the proposal. So this is also how the assembly kind of works in the Athenian, but the Athenians can make can make suggestions. So therefore, it's a very conservative institution in that sense. It has democratic input. The people get it to kind of ratify or block, but not to make. Okay. The common messes are better handled in the Cretes than the Spartans. This is a criticism, but saying that the Cretans do it better. In Sparta, each contributes a set of amount. Otherwise, the law prohibits him from taking part in the regime, as I said earlier. In Crete, it is handled instead by the common fashion. From all the crops and livestock derived from the public land and from the contributions of the subjects, one portion is set aside for the gods and for common sort of public service, and another for the common messes, so that everyone, women, children, and men, receive sustenance from the treasure. So, public assistance in that sense, right? The legislature has been clever in devising many things with a view to ensuring a beneficial scantiness of food, and with a view to segregating the women so as to prevent them from having many children. He has provided for the relationship between men. Whether this was poorly done or not will be investigated on another occasion, if I remember that right, which again, I remember correctly, it's not done. There's no discussion about the remainder of the politics we have it. In other words, it's a discussion of whether this was done. Is homosexuality a good thing? That the matter of common messes is better arranged among the Cretians and the Spartans than is evident. In other words, the argument here is that um, the uh, uh, the way the Cretans set up the messes and the deal with the ordinances of the way of feeding them and financing them is more democratic as it was intended, rather than the oligarchic tendency of that ultimately outcomes in that. And they do better with the segregating the women, and with the view of segregating the women than the Spartans do in that sense. Um, right. Now let's look at here. The matter of the orderers. Now this is 103. That the term is cosmoi, orderers, cosmoi, the cosmoi versus the ephoi. The okay, so the cosmoi, the orderers, uh, um, um, however, is even worse than that of the overseers. So it's a criticism. The worse For whatever is bad in the board of overseers exists in theirs as well, and it consists on average. For it consists of average person, but whereas here it is the advantageous. But whereas here it is advantageous for the regime, there it is not. So in other words, the same vices occur in it, but here he says for Sparta it's disadvantage to the regime. Here it is advantageous to the regime. So this is interesting. He says something that he can say negative. A negative thing can have something that has a negative trait. It can be identical in two different regimes, but one it's consistent and benefits that regime, and the other one it doesn't benefit, it harms that regime, right? And therefore, in the Spartan case, it's disadvantage. It disadvantages and harms the regime, and here it's beneficial or advantageous to the regime. And here, since the education is for all, the people share in the greatest offices and hence wish the regime to continue. So, therefore, in other words, everyone participates, even the poor, and where that's not the case in Sparta. Only those who are able to afford to contribute to the common masses are able to partake in the regime, and many Spartans who can't afford don't participate. So here, everyone can and everyone will do in that sense. There, however, they do not. There, however, they do not elect the orderers from all, but from certain families. So it's Cretan is, in other words, uh, in other words, there. This is again. This is the. Let's read this correctly. Here, here, I would think is free, right? Election from all. The people share in the greatest offices. And there, however, they do not elect the orderers from all, but from certain families, I guess the Spartans, and the senators from those whom had been had orderers. Uh, 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 that's interesting. So there means this is interesting. But he uses the word orderers, not ephoi. So that's this is. I wonder who's being referred to here. This is a little confusing. Um, um, the orderers are the term for the people who, if the Cretians, which the Spartans would call the ephoi, right? So he's talking about the ephois right here, right? The orderers. There's no orderers in the Spartan regime. He never mentioned them. So therefore, this is why this does describe the way the Spartans do it, right? Or de facto. So, and the suggestion is that this is that and that is that. In other words, this deals with the Cretians and this deals with the Spartan contrast, right? And one might make the same argument about these as about those who became overseers in Sparta. It is not safe that they go unaudited, that they should have thought through their lifetime that they should have throughout their lifetime a privilege which is greater than their merit. That they should have throughout their lifetime a privilege which is greater than their merit, and that they should rule not by written rules but at discretion. So this is what and because of this, they should. It is not safe that they go unlorded. In other words, is that they have great privilege of their lifetime, that which is greater than their merit. In other words, their character in that sense is not. They're elected by the people. Uh, um, and which and that they should not by written that they should be they're not governed by law written rules but are discretion they're things which Aristotle argues that this is something he'll talk about again in book 3 about the discussion of rule of law. Nor is it a sign of a fine or kolos arranged taxes, right? A fine or beautiful tax arrangement that the people keep quiet though not taking part. Okay. For the orderers have no source of gain as the overseers do. Okay. So therefore, this is again. I think this is interesting. Or maybe I'm wrong. Um, let's go back and read this carefully again. This is a confusing section. Um, My first reading of it would be I've read this before, but I'm just reading it here kind of blindly, like first time for you guys as well. Um, Here, since election is all people share in the greatest offices of the regime. There is, however, they all can do this, but they don't elect. They elect the orderers from all, but certain families and senators and the senators from those who have been ordered. So they don't elect them from all. Um, that all can, in other words, all since election is from all, the people share in the greatest offices and hence wish the regime to continue. Okay, that's like this. However, they do not elect the orderers, so that okay they share in that they go in there and they participate in the assembly and things like that. Um, but the orderers are elected. They do not elect the orderers from all. Okay, that's the other difference. But from the certain families. Okay, that's he's talking here about Crete. I'm sorry. I was wrong here. This is correct. This is why it's confusing in that sense. Um, uh, Here, the advantages of the regime is not. Here it is the election of all. Who's elected? I mean, the assembly of all is all citizens who participate. Um, there's no king. There's only the orders in that sense. The assembly is there. Maybe the other offices that are there. Okay, maybe that's what it could be referring to. That all the other officers in the regime are there. It's only the orderers. The orderers themselves are not elected. They are elected instead. The electors not elected from all, but from certain families only, and the senators from those who have been orderers. In other words, so not only certain families, and particularly that of the senators who have been orderers. So it's very dynastic oligarchy. It's kind of a dynastic oligarchy in that sense. You have to be the people who were those, and the parent fathers were that, and therefore they can be that. So who can be the orderers is very limited who they'll select from. And this, in other words, and because of this, they need to be should be ordered in that sense, right? He said, and he says that it's not a beautiful arrangement if the people keep quiet, not taking part in the orderers, right? For the orderers have no source of gain as the overseers do. They can't gain, they can't progress, since they dwell on the island far away from those who might corrupt them. So therefore, they don't have a sense they don't have the same aspects of the other countries and other actors, nearby neighbors and things that might try to influence them. So it's not like the Spartan overseers. The orderers are kind of fewer. They're not tempted by ambition in the same way. The cure they have found for this error is an odd one, characteristic not of political rule, but rule of the powerful dynasty. A dynasty. This is 104, right? Rule of now. This is dynasteia. And he says rule of the powerful. It is a term Aristotle will use for a narrow, kin-brace oligarchy that rules in a personalistic manner rather than under law. A dynastic means it's a very group of same people, the same family. It's dynastic. That's why I prefer using dynastic rather than powerful. Rule of the powerful. No, dynastic. He doesn't mean it's not talking about their power. He's talking about their. This is why I think I would disagree with the choice of the rule of the powerful for dynastia. It's dynastic rule. Um, it is, in other words, it is not political but dynastic, right? For often the orderers are expelled by a combination either of their own colleagues or of a private individual, and it is also open to the orderers to resign the office in the middle of the term. In other words, they can, it's kind of like more of a dynastic club, and therefore there's challenging competition from other ones like that, right? But it is better if all, no, he says, it is better if all these things are done in accordance with law rather than in accordance with human wish, as the latter is not a safe standard. In other words, again, remember, the overseers are not governed by law. In other words, there's not a written law or sets of rules which governs what they can and can't do. in that sense. So, how they make their decisions. They're not governed by law in the sense they're governed. And he makes the case again that this is not a good thing. This is a constant point that it's safer to have people who like this are governed by. If they're going to be have this power, they need to be, and you know, and particularly how they're. Um, he's going to even argue that even the powerful need should be guided by law. That yes, in book 3 he will say that the many are better tempered by this, but here he makes the point is that even here it's better to be guided by in accordance with law rather than accordance with human wish, or in other words, human whim or human discretion. Or the latter is not a safe standard. In other words, this is about this is a point that human action on human whim and what they want versus law. Law creates a certain kind of moderation. Law creates a certain kind of sophosune in that sense, moderation, temperance, right? But the worst thing of all, and let's continue, right? The worst thing of all is the condition term lack of order, which the powerful frequently establish when they do not wish to submit to a punishment. In other words, the dynasty, the dynastic class, by which it is clear their arrangement that their arrangement has elements of a regime, but is not so much a regime, but the rule of the dynasty, the powerful, the dynasty. In other words, it's very patrimonial in this sense. In other words, this idea that it is a regime, politeia. Again, regime is the word for politeia. It has an element of a politeia, but it is but it's not much really politeia, but rather it's the rule of this dynastic, this family, these families. Um, now submit to a punishment. This is this veto. This is like in Poland, you had the old Szlatka had in the same, every Szlatka had a right to veto legislation. Right. This is that they do not wish to submit to this lack of order. Now let's look at 105. What he says here. Apparently, the entire office could be declared to be in abeyance. Though how this was done was not known, it would seem that the orderers acted as public prosecutors in the Senate for a certain type of crime involving the dynasties. So therefore, they could or eliminate investigation of this in the Senate or um, the councilors. Right? They didn't have again. This is a mistake by Lord in his own note. He should have corrected this. There's not a Senate per se in that they have the councilors, right? The council, and that the council involved. Is I'm wrong on that? Let's maybe I misread that again. I need to go check that. Um, let's go. Guess that. Right. No, let's go. I'm sorry I'm doing this right now, but this is. Someone said maybe you should have a list of things, but nah. Okay, Spartan regime like that. That's the beginning point. Glenclaris, there. It goes right into the common messes, right? And overseers. Okay, yeah. Um, they talk about the overseers, right? And that. Um, the common messes are much better, right? This is the way the scantiness about women and thing. Um, uh, 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 matters of the orderers, right? It was even worse than that. Why does he have a king? They don't mention the king. I remember they mentioned the king, and I'm trying to think of why. Where is? Ah, there it is. Um, yeah, okay, this is where it is. This is in 6. The overseers have the same powers as theirs, except for 5. One has 5, and the other have 10. The senators are equal of their senators. Um, the senators have the same size in the Senate of how they're doing the different selection, right? And whereas they call them the councils, whom the creations called council. Okay, so it's named senator versus council. That's the big difference. Okay, and I'm not wrong. Again, so they lack of orders. They can block that in the Senate. In other words, the orderers can block things in the Senate through this kind of veto on the Senate, right? Because out of a lack of order. It is habitual with them to have followings among the people and their friends, create petty monarchies, and engage in factional conflict and fighting with one another. In other words, the orderers form kind of quasi patronage relationships with the people, right? Many. Um, and that they use their patronage relationship with the people as and the disputes among them create a factional conflict, right? Um, what Aristotle describes here is the effect something akin to the feudal system of Europe. Again, what's happening here is that again the feudal system of Europe is that the serfs and that an aristocrat, a landlord would have serf people, and they would have a size of this, and there's also subordinated smaller aristocrats would have. In other words, there's the serfs and that, and then there's bigger aristocrats in medium size and smaller aristocrats. So therefore, at every level there's interconnection. Here, what happens here is that the orderers have relationships with the citizens, and therefore they form patronage relationships, and that therefore they form and the fighting between the different orderers and families and dynasties within the orderers, the dynastic families, the orderers will then what have relationships with people underneath them as kind of this, and this is how it goes. And this kind of becomes this how we can understand feudalism, and I guess also very mafia-like, right? This is the families. Yet, how does this sort of thing differ from the cities actually ceasing? How does this thing differ from the cities actually ceasing to be for such a period, and the political things dissolving? In other words, this is he's saying that the political thing kind of, in other words, um, they become petty monarchies. Each dynastic thing becomes a petty monarchy, and they engage with that faction of this. And he says, yet how does this sort of thing differ from the city actually ceasing to be for such period? They enter civil war. In other words, the city itself falls apart. In other words, that there's not much holding. That once these become little petty separate monarchies in that sense, then the whole collapses. He's saying, and the political community, which everyone was a member of, ceases. Okay, so how does this not this situation of the behavior of the Cretan dynasties becoming like little monarchies of themselves, um, and that this is the question. This is the question of there is a question of that the Cretan regime lacks regimeness. In other words, it seems to be rather the rule of these petty dynastic family clans rather than a real regime, even though they had a regime. Um, but these dynastic families became clearly more powerful, right? And therefore, this is how does this not dissolve from this? Is Aristotle's argument. In other words, this is and from Weber's language, this is the problem of patrimonialism. The patrimonial character undermines that. In other words, the create a political community, something common that we share in common, requires the forming of something that transcends mere patrimonial ownership. In other words, that the idea that I may own it, but this is something common that we share of this. I may have authority over it, but it's not mine, and I can do what I want with it. Whereas the dynasties treat this as their own. In other words, they treat not the whole, but their clan, their group's interest, and their supporters as theirs, and therefore compete with others. Right? That's the whole point he's saying, and that's why it falls apart. This is why the city ceases to be, and it almost seems to cease to be, and the political community, the political koinonia ceases, dissolves in that sense, right? Um, a city in this condition is also a great danger from those who wish and are able to attack it. But as it was said, Krish is preserved by its location. So its location is this. If this condition was near other cities, it would always be vulnerable. But its location keeps it. Distance has acted as the equivalent of a law expelling foreigners, right? As acted as the makes it difficult for foreigners. The Spartans were well known in their strict control of periodic expulsion of aliens present in the Spartan territories. And he says Xenophon's Constitution of Macedonia says the Spartans expel people. The Cretians don't have to. It's the distance, it's space. On this account, too, the subjects put up with the creations. In other words, while the Helots frequently revolt. So therefore, the serfs or the people conquered by the creations, um, subjects, they don't revolt. Why? They put up with it because it's they don't have help. Where the Cretan, the Helots and the Spartans do revolt. Okay, for the Creations do not for the Creations do not share in external rule, but only recently has foreign war comes to their island and made evident the weakness of laws there. Now this is 2008, which he talks about. This could be a reference to either both events. In other words, could be either or both events. The operations conducted by Crete by the Phoenician adventurer Perseus in this period, right, and the subjugation of Ireland by Augelius the Spartan, right, brother of the Spartan king Aegeus, right. Either one of these two things could be referred to that situation by Aristotle. Um, and Concerning this regime, let us say this much. No more. He ends the discussion of Crete. It's in some ways better that, and it's sometimes it seems to be a little better than the Spartans, and it has some of the same. It does some things better with the Spartans, the messes and the education of the women, but in some ways it's worse in Sparta in the sense but that sometimes it's in other words in ways it's worse. Sometimes it's in other words, their overseers have the same, and the FOI are kind of the same problem. Um, uh, but what happens here is that they are um, uh, one is in for Sparta, it's disadvantageous, and for Crete, maybe it is a little bit advantageous. The regime benefits. The regime benefits from not having foreign. It's not being close to its enemies or having people easy access it. In other words, its location gives a massive benefit to the regime. If it was in a different location, this may not be as advantageous. Some of these things that thing. So again, this is how we end the examination of Crete. Again, I'm sorry if I kind of did this. Every time I go through Crete, I always have to read it, and I didn't. Lord's changing some things from his other edition. Some changes were good, some changes were bad. That's what. Okay, we'll see this. If you have any comments, please put them down. Questions or things like that, please put them below. I'll respond. If you liked it, like it. If you don't like it, say why. Subscribe for you. Share this on social media if you liked it. Share it on social media. Encourage others to join and subscribe. If you wish to follow me on social media, you can follow the links below. If you wish to be a Patreon or a subscriber member to help contribute to this, please do so. And if you don't want to do that, but still want to help, you can always buy my book at Lulu. We have on Amazon, other places, but if you buy by Lulu, I get more money, so you can help me more in that sense. And it's a great Christmas gift for young students studying. It's basically a notebook of Aristotle's politics. It's like a Cliff's Notes on the politics. It's not a commentary. It is a study guide. It helps you go through. It helps someone going through it. It's not to be read in substitute of the politics, but it's read to be along with it. So it has like chapter by chapter kind of outline structures, looking at charts to do things. It help you order the text and try to understand it. Um, it's useful in that sense. It's a student or someone wishing to understand it, who's going to read the politics text and study it. It also has a bibliography with very diverse. I got this from someone else. I asked them could I use it because why reinvent the wheel? I just changed it a little bit for some things, but it's again useful for students, useful for scholars, useful for young people, people who are going to be reading it on their own. On that, we'll end. I hope you have a good day. Take care and bye bye.